This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's August 15th, 2021. I'm Ross John Fortune. When he left office in 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower used his farewell address to warn of a new, pervasive power in American life.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
60 years after that speech, Eisenhower's words have largely come true. The Defense Department is the largest and most funded agency, and the biggest firms contracting with the Pentagon are traded on the stock market. Some, like Lockheed Martin and Boeing, have market caps surpassing $100 billion. Other non-defense specific firms, like Microsoft, contract with the Pentagon and have market caps exceeding $1 trillion. The Pentagon allocated $420 billion in contracts in fiscal 2020, over half of the total defense budget. These companies also show up in the personal stock portfolios of some of the most powerful members of Congress, including those making decisions on the Pentagon budget. While the lobbying industry surrounding the military-industrial complex is vast, similarly contributing to the ethical issues surrounding it is the lack of any rules around members of Congress owning individual stock. There are virtually no rules in place that restrict or prohibit members of Congress who sit on these committees from holding direct financial stakes in defense firms. According to data compiled by Open Secrets and Smart Insider, there are a dozen members of Congress who have some direct financial investment in the defense industry while sitting on committees related to appropriations and defense. Even if they are all acting above board, the optics of such investments are very bad and signal the influence of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about. Dylan Hedtler-Gaudette is a government affairs manager at the Project on Government Oversight, and Nathan Siegel is an intern at POGO. They are also co-authors on a piece on the POGO site right now, headlined, "Representatives Are Too Invested in Defense Contractors." After a short break, they'll join me to discuss their post and the ethics of members of Congress owning stock in defense companies.
When a shiny new technology pops up, when a newly discovered flaw exploits a bedrock legacy system, when Congress and leadership demand modernization but won't provide more resources, when every update is critical, you need analysis that cuts through the noise to tell you exactly what you need to know. Join the Next Gov team as we speak with relevant federal leaders and experts to break down the science, the tech, the policies, and the people behind the latest emerging technologies. Subscribe in the Apple Store, Google Play, or through your favorite podcast platform to make sure you get the latest critical update.
The Defense Department is the largest and most funded agency in the United States federal government. Its budget is measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and some of the publicly traded firms with which the Pentagon contracts have market caps over $100 billion. The ethics around this come into play when members of Congress who control the defense budget legislation also own stocks in the very publicly traded companies that may benefit from that defense budget. Dylan Hedtler-Gaudette is a government affairs manager at the Project on Government Oversight, and Nathan Siegel is an intern at POGO as well. They are co-authors on a piece on the POGO site right now, headlined, "Representatives Are Too Invested in Defense Contractors." They join me now to discuss their post and conflicts of interest in Congress. Welcome to the show. Dylan, we'll start with you. We've talked on this show before with you about the Stock Act. Why did you feel compelled, or timing wise, why did you two write this about the defense industry right now?
Yeah, thank you, Ross. So Right now, as you pointed out, is a critical time in Congress because Congress is in the midst of considering the annual defense policy bill, the National Defense Authorization Act, and actually the House has already passed its version of the bill, and that bill top line clocked in at $839 billion. But we're talking about a large pot of money, and we're talking about the agency, the Defense Department, that accounts for over $400 billion in contract awards every year. And if you add that all up together, that's more contract awards than every other federal agency combined. So we're talking about a very large pool of taxpayer dollars here. And one of the issues with that, beyond all of the intricacies we could get into about which programs are worth spending money on, which ones are wasteful, which ones aren't working, that's a whole separate set of discussion that we'd be happy to get into perhaps on another podcast. But the problem here is that the people who are making these decisions about the amount of money we're going to spend and what we're going to spend money on and who's going to ultimately receive contracts, they are members of Congress. And right now there are almost no ethics rules for members of Congress around A, what kind of financial interest they can have in terms of stock ownership in some of these very same companies, and B, what kind of campaign contributions they can receive directly from those very same companies. But you see kind of an ethical negative feedback loop here, and it's a huge problem. It comes up every year, and Congress hasn't yet done anything about it, although there are pretty robust and active negotiations ongoing right now about trying to at the very least address the stock aspect of this by perhaps creating restrictions and a flat out prohibition on members of Congress being able to own and trade stocks. So that's a very kind of broad level, sort of 10,000 foot TLDR of where we are right now and why this issue is important and why we chose to write about it right now.
Nathan, let's sort of talk about why it's important and how the public sees it. Congress is hardly popular when it comes to public opinion polling. How does that factor into this? How do you personally feel about members of Congress trading stocks, and how does the public feel about it, and why is that important?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the last question and why it's important. It's important because ultimately they are the ones that approve the funds that go into these agencies and go into the Department of Defense that fund the defense measures that we have for the United States. And when you have an accountable Congress, what you're really wanting to see is, are they not captured, or are they not influenced by outside entities that could significantly sway the way they allocate their funding? And it's important to the public that we have this information, and it is important that this information is shared and collated. And fortunately, we do have a lot of this information already provided through various sources, including Open Secret, Smart Insider, and news articles which share this information. So this is very important because, again, these outside influences through PAC funding, through stocks, can significantly influence the way that members of Congress choose to vote. And this is something that ordinary people don't have that access to, can't influence, because, that's just kind of how it is. But I think this is important because of the fact that there is this data, and it clearly shows a significant at least a potential significant influence on members of Congress.
Yeah, just to follow up on that a little bit, I think Nathan did a great job of encapsulating the sort of broad strokes of why this is important. And just to put a little bit of meat on the bones, so we're talking about some extraordinarily large companies that receive tens of billions of dollars each year in taxpayer funded contracts. And what these defense companies often do is they're very smart. This is not, they know what they're doing. And what they do is they strategically place some of their operations in various important congressional districts and states all over the country. That way they've got a direct line into the members of Congress office, so they can always say, hey, look, we got X number of jobs in your district here, we got X number of jobs in your state here. It'd be a shame if those jobs went away, so you should probably support program X or program Y. That's going to help the bottom line, the share price of giant defense contractor X here, right? So it's a lot of being captured and influenced because of the sort of economic reason. But then on the other side of that, as we've mentioned a couple of times, these very same companies, usually using PACs, will directly donate to the campaigns of members of Congress who are making these decisions. And specifically, we're talking about some key committees that are in charge of making these decisions. We're talking about the Arms Services Committee, and you have one in the Senate and you have one in the House as well. So you've got an Armed Services Committee in both chambers, and then you've also got the Defense Subcommittee of each chamber's Appropriations Committee, and that's where all the dollars actually get appropriated to fund everything that the Armed Services Committee choose to put in the NDAA, right? So what these companies do is they strategically try to influence, and they do a very good job of influencing the key decision makers on those committees. And that's how we have an ever expanding defense budget. And then, on the other side of all of that, you've got many of those same exact decision makers owning stock in, say, Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or something like that. So it's a cesspool is what it is. And it creates a sort of a downward spiral of bad policy making, of bad optics, and that feeds into public, perceptions about Congress being corrupt. And we see right now in the latest Pew Research data, we see that Congress has an 18% approval rating, which weirdly is actually a little higher than it has been in recent years, but still extraordinarily low.
Yeah, it's certainly low, but it's funny you mentioned Raytheon just because of the presence of Lloyd Austin as defense secretary. These conflicts are sort of inherent in a lot of places. And I guess to play devil's advocate, I will quote from the Speaker of the House to say that, can't these companies participate in the free market? Can't these members of Congress participate in the free market? Nathan, I'll sort of shoot that with you. Like, sort of, what's the sort of free market, I guess, response to that, as far as Speaker Pelosi would say?
Yeah, and so we've had multiple. I mean, first and foremost, in terms of overall funding, we have the top 10 companies in the 2020 election cycle. Raytheon down to Leidos donate around $4.9 million to members of defense committees and subcommittees. And that amount can be a lot higher or a lot lower. They can give as much as you want. And I know the argument is often, and this is the thing in Citizens United, this is speech. This is a political speech. But I want to iterate why this is important, because these are elected officials. They are representing their districts. They are representing the United States. And when they are choosing to, or when they are significant, they could be significantly swayed by these large swaths of money coming in through PAC funds, as well as their own investments that they own through, or stocks or investments that they own. It can significantly impact the decisions that they make. And again, these decisions that they make will impact the taxpayers in the United States. So whatever fiduciary interests they have could ultimately sway people overall, and the large swaths of money that they donate to these PAC campaigns, or the stocks that members of Congress own. These aren't things that the society chooses. People choose. This is what what members of Congress choose to accept in terms of funding, and additionally, what they choose to own in terms of the fiduciary assets or interests. Do you have anything else to add, Dylan?
Yeah. So I just want to stress and reiterate that when we're talking about members of Congress, but this is also true of people in the other two branches of government, be the executive branch or the judiciary, we're talking about public servants, and the key word in that phrase is public. The reason that we elect people to Congress, the reason that people are appointed to other branches and they have to swear an oath to to advance the public interest, essentially, and the reason why taxpayers pay their salary and all of that is because we have a basic compact that we agree to, and that is that you, as a member of Congress or as an executive branch official or federal judge, you are there to do the public's interest. That's what you're there for. That's what we're paying you for. That's what we elect you for. So the reason it gets tricky and challenging and problematic here is because when you have these other reasons, these other things that are at play that are potentially, and I think in oftentimes in actuality, driving the decision making and the actions and the behavior of these public servants, that's where it starts to be a huge problem from an ethical standpoint, from a corruption standpoint, because we can't be sure as constituents, as voters, that the people we send to Washington to do our bidding, are actually doing our bidding. Is that what they're doing, or are they doing the bidding of themselves and their own financial pecuniary interests, or perhaps the financial pecuniary interests of large, well-connected, powerful corporate stakeholders? And it isn't just defense. We point this out in the piece. Defense is a particularly glaring and kind of odious example of this problem, but there are all kinds of other large, entrenched, powerful interests and stakeholders who represent other aspects of the economies. Think about Wall Street, financial services, pharmaceuticals, biotech, whatever it is, who basically do the same thing. They just tend to operate in other committees beyond arms services and beyond the defense related committees. So it's a institutional broad problem. And the reason we chose to focus on the military industrial congressional complex aspect of this is because it crops up in a very clear, visible, glaring way each year with the NDAA process.
So yeah, I mean, I some of that was setting up, and I'm not gonna really play devil's advocate as much anymore, just to sort of build off what you were saying. I think having seen online, you mentioned open secrets and sites like that bring these trades to the public. Recently I saw online people pointing out the stock trades by members of Congress as the CHIP Act was being brought forth, how much they were picking up these processor companies like Intel and things like that. This, with the obvious appearance of impropriety. Maybe they just had a wild hair and decided Intel's a good investment without respect to what they were working on, but that strikes me as a little bit of a far-fetched excuse. So I guess, and Nathan, I'll bring this to you. It's so glaring. It seems to me, as a member of the public, a taxpaying member of the public, that this is so flagrantly unethical. How does it keep happening? And maybe it's a leading question, but why are they still doing this? Why are members of Congress still doing this?
Yeah, in terms of, and again, I primarily looked at stock contributions or stock investments, as well as campaign contributions through PAC funding. But there are two different mechanisms, and none of which has really been at all enforceable in Congress to fix these systems that we have in Congress. And moreover, people both on the Democrat side and the Republican side are, regardless of the political belief or association, have continued with this system in Congress. And it is a perpetual system that I think needs to be fixed. But unfortunately, there are no enforcement mechanisms with stocks. Certainly, there are rules, but a lot of these rules are more or less guidance in terms of reporting schemes and things like that. And then also, in addition to that, with PAC funding, Citizens United, as you can this is political speech. So there's no either there are no enforcement mechanisms with stocks, or it's protected political speech with PAC funding.
Yeah, I think we're also running into sort of a cultural problem in Congress, right? So the irony here is that Congress has actually required a lot stronger rules around things like financial conflicts of interest for executive branch officials. For example, the executive branch, they're subject to a criminal conflict of interest statute, and what that means in practice is that the office OGE over in the executive branch, which is in charge of enforcing ethics rules and providing guidance and advice to executive branch officials, they just basically straight up as a matter of practice require the vast majority of executive branch officials, including very low level officials, they just can't own stocks and things that could be potential conflicts of interest because of this criminal conflict of interest statute. And then if you add to that the sort of ethics agreements and things like that have to be agreed to and signed on to if you're an executive branch official, there are certain things that the Senate requires of appointees around ethics and conflicts of interest that they don't require of themselves. So we're seeing a huge double standard here in Congress. And I think that's a cultural problem. Congress basically says conflicts of interest for me, but not for thee. And I don't think there's any excuse for that. There's no excuse at all. And you see it kind of in the response of some members of Congress to the recent, the efforts around trying to ban and restrict stock trading in Congress. You see from the Speaker of the House all the way down to rank and file, like people in the House or the Senate who react very sort of like dismissively to the public's concern about stock trading and about conflicts of interest. You see there's just a disdain for what we think about this issue. And that speaks to, I think, a sort of a cultural ethical rot that is at the core of Congress.
Well, let's sort of end on next steps. How can this be fixed? Is there any possibility for it being fixed? What should we look forward to here?
Well, the good news is that, as I've mentioned a couple of times earlier, there are some members of Congress who genuinely understand that this is a huge problem, and there are very active negotiations and a process and an effort underway right now to produce a bill. There have already been some bills introduced by several members of Congress and supported by members across the aisle that would either restrict ownership of stock or would restrict trading of stocks. So there is some momentum and energy around that. Unfortunately, as we approach the end of the year, the time window is really shrinking around the ability to get that done in light of the calendar of legislative days left in Congress and the midterm election impending. So we really need Congress to kick it into gear here and to get something done on the stock trading. And then when it comes to other things around potential committee assignments and how those pose conflicts of interest and campaign contributions, a lot of that, there isn't much discussion around that, although there are some interesting provisions in the NDAA that would enhance some of these rules around executive branch officials. Again, Congress is happy to do things to impose restrictions on other people, but not for themselves. One thing Congress can do, though, if it doesn't want to go through all the hassle of passing laws like it's supposed to, is they could, amend their internal rules, and they could provide sort of like actual guidelines and parameters and a framework around, okay, if you're going to be on committee X, you cannot own stock, that has an obvious conflict of interest here. But to use our example in the piece we just wrote, if you want to be on the Arms Services Committee, fine, but here's a list of companies you cannot be invested in and companies you cannot take campaign donations from. Congress has the ability to do that for itself if it wants to. It just doesn't really want to, as far as we can tell, although we absolutely encourage them to do things along those lines.
Yeah, that would be very welcome, at least I think in a lot of corners of the good government world, and certainly in the transparency world. And I know I would not be sad to see something like that happen. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being on the show with us.
Thank you, Russ.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortunet. We want to thank Hedtler-Gaudette and Nathan Siegel for joining the program. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.